Hey guys, once again, I am back for some more deaf information. So, just a side note, real quick, I should have stated this in my first video. Any information that is about the deaf community, deaf people, deaf culture, anything ASL, it really technically should come from people of the eye, deaf people within themselves. The only reason I'm doing this is because I feel like I had a lot of good resources, such as my textbooks, to provide this information. And as I stated in my first video, I am doing this for a project for college. So, totally up to you, but I personally feel that any information dealing with deaf persons should come from them. So, moving on, today's talk is on history. No, I don't mean American history, deaf history. I feel like I know more deaf history than I do American. If you also see me flip a paper, it's because I have so many notes to talk about that I'm ready to give it all for you. So just don't mind that. So starting off, there is not much information about deaf people who lived in America before the year 1817. Not much. But there is a wonderful story about people who decided to start the first American school for the deaf. And I feel like that is dearly, dearly noted and should be taken note of because this was just such an impact and startup for deaf people to be themselves that it can't be passed by. So starting off, we have Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Now, Gallaudet, that word may sound familiar. If you're from the DC area, Gallaudet University is like the deaf college to go to. It's the place where you're just fully immersed in ASL and people, deaf people of their community, and anyone who is open to their community. So, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, he was a graduate of Yale University. He was training to become a minister, actually. Then he met a young deaf girl named Alice, the daughter of his neighbor, Dr. Mason Cogswell, as a well-known doctor in Hartford, Connecticut. Gallaudet tried to teach Alice to read and write a few words and had some success. Cogswell was impressed by Gallaudet's initial efforts and encouraged him to become more involved in establishing a school for the deaf in America for deaf people. So Cogswell and a group of concerned citizens raised enough funds to send Gallaudet to Europe to learn about methods for instructing deaf people. So Sicard, who was a director of a school for deaf students in Paris. He was in London with two of his deaf pupils, also teaching at the Paris school, Jean Messieu and Laurent Clerc. They were giving demonstration of the French method of instructing deaf students. This method used signs from French Sign Language, in short, created by French deaf people, with an added set of signs called Les Signes Méthodiques. Oh my god, I probably totally messed that wording up. I don't take French. If anything, I know a little Spanish. But my major is ASL. So in English, methodical signs. Talking is hard. That's why I went to a language where I don't have to talk. So, moving on, these methodical signs were invented by Abbe Charles de Leppe, the founder and first director of the school in Paris. So, moving along with notes, I have so much. But you know what? That's a good thing. And my goal is to get it out to you, so here we are. If you're watching this, bless. So, Gallaudet was first impressed by the presentations of Sicard, Messieu, and Clerc. he asked Sicard to teach him the French method of education using signs, and Sicard agreed. So, Gallaudet went to Paris, and there he began to learn French signs from Monsieur and Clerc, and the teaching method from Sicard. After a short while, Gallaudet wanted to return to Hartford and convince Clerc to go back with him to help establish a school. So a group of people sent Gallaudet off, and he ended up coming back with a buddy. So far, so good. But during that travel, those 52 days on ship to America, Clerc continued to teach signs to Gallaudet, and he taught Clerc the English language. So it was a very beneficial process. Clerc's third language, after learning French Sign Language, and French, by the way. So we are at year 1817, April 15th, with the funds from the state of Connecticut, the U.S. Congress, and other sympathetic groups that cared. Gallaudet and Clerc established the Institution for Deaf Mutes, later renamed American Asylum for the Education of the Deaf and Dumb, which is now the American School for the Deaf. Mouthful. Whew. So Clerc remained there as an instructor for over 40 years. Like, that's pretty good. But he was a part of establishing it. So I assume his legacy, he wanted to stay with the school. But during this time, Clerc also trained some hearing people who later became the directors of schools for deaf students in New York, Kentucky, Virginia, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Quebec. There we go. So now adding another character in the midst. I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but you know what? This is a video. You can go back. So we are now talking about George W. Videtz, a deaf teacher who became the president of the National Association of the Deaf, NAD, in 1904, said, "As long as we have deaf people, we will have sign language." Before the development of ASL, American Sign Language, there was home sign, and 60% of ASL came from FLS, French Sign Language. So a mix of the two. Sign languages are used to effectively communicate with each other. Various scholars through the centuries have argued that the first languages used in prehistoric time were gestural languages. You follow me? This came before this, talking. Remember that. So, there is even some evidence suggesting that the vocal apparatus necessary for speech did not develop until afterwards, later. So, a note, so that's a cute little story, but it is a huge part of history that I feel like a lot of people should at least understand, not know by heart, but at least understand this is how things got started. And just, you need a couple people that care. That's it. Because one attracts more, which attracts more, and then, you know what? You got this whole group going. It's amazing what a domino effect can do. So, discussing deaf persons' lives before the year 1880, signing was openly accepted. Hearing people realized, oh, signing benefits humanity. And they looked at deaf people as equals. There was Martha's Vineyard, which was a complete island just for people to sign. No speaking loud. Signing only. I wish we'd still had islands like that, places like that, where we could all just go and feel equal to each other. Before oralism, signing use was equal education, meaning that signing was equivalent to speaking. That people saw it as the same, that the language is a language is a language. Understand? So, people were aware that deaf people existed. as I've said, I think it was the first video, I met someone who didn't even know who a deaf person was. They're like, what are deaf people? And I'm like, who deaf people are? And then I went on. Obviously not as sassy, but man, just some people you look at them and you're like, you're not educated. And I believe knowledge is power. Remember that. Moving on to more examples. Europe and North America, deaf institutes were established through both continents. Deaf people were in headmaster positions. Deaf people were influencing younger generations that we are deaf people. We are humans just as the next. That the only thing we can't do is hear, but we can be just as good as the next person. Deaf people were artists. They wrote political pamphlets. They were involved. And look where we are now. They're oppressed. John Messieu was the first deaf teacher at Paris before Laurent Clerc in the USA. It's a bit of a side note, but those are your presidents. After 1880, though, deaf education went to a shithole. Complete oppression. If a teacher saw a student signing, the punishment would be a smacked ruler to the hands. When I was younger, there was a game called Slappy Happy where you grabbed another person's hand and you slapped as hard as you could. Picture that, but with a ruler, as punishment for communicating. What? Another punishment would be to kneel on some sort of stick, typically like a broomstick, so you knelt on that, while holding two books out to the side. I don't even know how to... This is torture. This isn't even punishment. This is torture on children who are just trying to learn to communicate. I think this is what sets me off the most, is that without communication, there's nothing. That's why there's gestures, because if you can't talk, if you don't have the acquired skills to speak, then obviously you're going to find another way. And once that is taken away, what then? Ooh. So by preventing signing, children would have to put mitts on their hands. Not the finger gloves, the mitts, where your fingers cannot be distinguished from each hand shape. So on top of it all, teachers were forcing oralism, specifically English, down the throats of deaf students, forcing them to try to speak, even though it took a lot more than that. But my personal side note is I just don't understand that people back in the early 1800s had a better common sense and knowledge to understand that deaf people were in existence and had the brains to acquire a language and a community, a culture even, among themselves. I am frustrated. I am mad that with all of the advances that brought us to this day and age, people still do not understand culture in general. Because if they did, a lot of the shit happening right now wouldn't be happening. Cultures thrive individually in groups, yes, separate, but from other, when those differences come together, new ideas form and a better understanding and future comes along with that. I feel better. So, with the story, with how deaf people were treated at a specific time and how it changed in the blink of an eye for them, and how that, what came afterwards, the oralism, the autism, the oppression, how that continually came across 100 years later, 150 years later, and they're still dealing with it. That is a bowl of crap to me. I feel better. So I hope this video was informational about how things got started how they thrived, how the deaf community thrived at one point, and how their light was taken from them in a blink of an eye just to hearing ignorance. My note to you guys is please understand culture. Watch the last video. Thank you.